Now let's introduce our panel of experts. Joining me from the United States, Cirincione is a national security analyst and the author of Bomb Scare, The History and Future of Nuclear Weapons. He is also the former president of Ploughshares Fund, vice president for national security at the Center for American Progress, and director of the Non-Proliferation Program at the Carnegie Endowment. He served for 9 years on the professional staff of the House Armed Services Committee and the Government Operations Committee. He is adjunct faculty at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Joining me from Beijing, Dr. Wenping is the research program director at the Institute of West Asian and African Studies of Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. She specializes in Africa's relations with China and major Western powers, South-South cooperation, and the Middle East international relations. She also serves as an associate researcher in the Center for Chinese Studies of Stellenbosch University in South Africa and a council member of World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on the Future of Africa. Joining us from Tehran, we have Dr. Hassan Ahmadian. Dr. Ahmadian is an assistant professor of Middle East and North Africa Studies at the University of Tehran, as well as a Middle East Security and Politics Fellow at the Center for Strategic Research in Tehran. Ahmadian is also a postdoctoral research fellow at the Iran Project, Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. His research and teaching work is mainly focused on Iran's foreign policy and relations, political change, civil-military relations, and Islamist movements in the Middle East. Last but not least, we have Ellie Geranmayeh joining us from London. Ellie Geranmayeh is a senior policy fellow and deputy head of the Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. She specializes in European foreign policy in relations to Iran, particularly on the nuclear and regional matters and sanctions policy. Geranmayeh advised European governments and companies on the nuclear negotiations between Iran and world powers from 2013 to 2015 and continues to brief senior policymakers on how to effectively safeguard the implementation of the nuclear agreement. Without further ado, let's begin our discussion on the future of the Iran nuclear deal. Yesterday marked the 5th anniversary of the Iran nuclear deal, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was supposed to curb Iran's nuclear activities and allow for strict IAEA's inspection in exchange for lifting of economic sanctions on Iran. Meanwhile, it also aimed to build trust between Washington and Tehran in order to be able to negotiate on other issues and even move toward normalization of relations in the long term. However, with the election of President Trump, everything turned upside down overnight. And the US, in a surprising move, unilaterally withdrew from the UN Security Council-backed agreement and reimposed sanctions on Iran against the will of the international community. While Iran has still remained in the deal, it has rolled back some of its commitments under the accord. For instance, it has enriched uranium beyond the permitted level, refused to ship out its enriched uranium, and accelerated research and development of advanced centrifuges. With a few months left until the US presidential elections, the remaining parties to the JCPOA are faced with a variety of challenging scenarios to save an already hobbled agreement amid Iran-US tensions. Now I would like to ask our panelists to share with us their assessment of current state of the Iran nuclear deal and how perhaps this deal could be salvaged and implemented multilaterally as it was designed to be in 2015. Let's start with Joe.
Sure, thank you very much. A pleasure to be part of this panel, and I'll keep my introductory remarks short. First of all, it is remarkable that the Iran deal is still alive. As Monty Python would say, I'm not dead yet. And that's because the Europeans have worked mightily to keep the deal alive. Iran has not left the deal, even though the US is in flagrant violation of the deal. And Russia and China have played a supportive role to keep the framework there. So if this deal can survive for the rest of the year, there's the possibility that it can be resuscitated and be brought back to some sort of healthy state. We'll see. That depends a lot on US policy. So what is US policy towards Iran? There is no US policy towards Iran. You cannot talk about an American policy. It is too fractured. It is too fragmented. And this begins with the president himself. President Trump does not have an Iran strategy. He has a series of impulses, a desire to use some kind of meeting with Iranian officials to aid in his election. Pretty similar to what he did with North Korea, but there's no plans for doing that. There's no strategy for how to arrange even a photo op. So the policy is adrift at the top. Within the administration, there are different points of view on Iran. Mike Pompeo, right now, as we talk, is giving remarks in the State Department. He will undoubtedly blast Iran. He always does. He has a policy of maximum pressure. That is an almost sadistic policy towards inflicting pain on Iran in the hope that something will happen, some kind of collapse, some kind of insurrection, some kind of overthrow. Within the administration, there are also those who are much more active, much more forceful than Pompeo. And these are people like John Bolton who actually want military strikes on Iran and may have been involved in what appears to be sabotage of recent Iranian facilities. They're supported in the United States by groups like AIPAC, like the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, like the Washington Institute on the Middle East, et cetera, who have a very militant regime change strategy. If Joe Biden is elected president, all that will change, but it's not clear how it will change. Joe Biden has said if he is elected president, he will rejoin the JCPOA as long as, here's the caveat, as long as Iran returns to compliance. Well, how exactly do you orchestrate that? It's not clear, and there are divisions within the Democrats between those who want to withdraw right away, which I would favor, and those who want to use the turmoil created by Donald Trump as some kind of leverage to extract even more concessions from Iran before the US would withdraw. It's unclear how exactly Joe Biden will go about this. And of course, it's complicated by the upcoming elections next year in Iran. So in sum, there is no US policy. There are factions, there's contention. And what we all hope is that we can just keep this together for another 5 months, and the November elections might elect a president who actually has a clear, competent strategy.
Thank you very much, Joe, for your opening statement. Now we can go to Wenping. I think you're mute. Wenping, I think, let me press it. Okay, perfect. Now we can hear you.
Now can you hear me? Okay. So it's very good. I think to hear the first opening remarks come from you. Yeah, I also echo. That is, we all congratulations for this nuclear deal. Iran nuclear deal still survive. It's not easy to keep it survive until now, even though the United States unilaterally withdraw from this deal since 2018. So almost 2 years passed, and then it's not easy. So we need to, congratulations for that. So how to keep going, make this nuclear deal continue surviving? I think now the Iran, government, either the government and the society is facing, increasing pressure. A lot of challenges now on the shoulder of Iran. One is those sanctions remain there, and even we are going to add more. For example, this October, this embargo is going to expire or continue, for forever. So this is a recent the challenge is going to be. So it needs those poor forces. Now we have seen two kinds of forces. One is the push, another is the pull. So the push forces coming from United States, even though just the one country, I think, plus maybe Israel in the Middle East. Now we see the recent explosion in the Iran, this uranium enrichment facility. So that's another kind of a push force trying to to make Iranian side make more reaction, and then maybe withdraw by also unilaterally from Iranian side, but we haven't seen so far. So we need to see add more those poor forces, trying to make this deal remain there. So number one task, I think, is the coming October thing, this arms embargo, how to save it, how to, make those try coming from United States not that successful. Another thing is help Iranian to deal with this COVID-19. Now they are facing the COVID-19 and also sanction and also economic difficulty. So it's not easy. So how to help Iranian side to strengthen their confidence, remain saying they still can be the beneficiary from stick to this deal. So that's another issue. So those help, of course, coming from China, coming from Russia, coming from all the European countries remain there. But so it's maybe they think from Iranian side is not that stronger enough, especially for the economic situation. So we need to think out what kind of way, especially now that many challenges are there. So in my words, we need to add more those forces for those poor forces, and then get less of those push forces. Otherwise, how can all those partners to remain like hold on for another 5 months, just to count on what's the next U.S. administration, Joe Biden or Trump, if re-elected, maybe things are getting worse or whatever. So you cannot just, my point is, you cannot just count on to see what kind of future U.S. administration will be, and then you should do something from this poor part, poor force, add some more here. So that will keep a balance, not put this fate for surviving this this nuclear deal just counting on someone else there in their hand. Well,
these are all. I have questions for all of these guys. And now thank you very much for your opening statement. We can go to Hassan.
Can you help?
Thank you, Younes. So, do you hear me, Younes? Okay.
Yes.
So I'll start with some quick points as introductory remarks. The United States, after withdrawal, tried to withdraw from the JCPOA, tried to deprive Iran of the benefits it was promised in the JCPOA. It was successful to a large extent. It barred many businesses from working within Iran and withdraw from the Iranian market. The Europeans, for that matter, did not observe many of their commitments within the deal. Not only during the U.S. Withdrawal, not only their JCPOA commitments, but also the commitments they made after the U.S. withdrawal from the deal. So they have made some promises during the 1 year after U.S. withdrawal in 3 high official meetings, and they were drafted, but they didn't observe even those commitments. So the United States withdrew. The Europeans didn't commit to and didn't observe their commitments within the deal. Now, because the United States maximum pressure campaign did not push Iran to the to the extent to which the United States thought they will, and bring Iran, force it to a table on U.S. terms. Now the United States is pushing further to make it hard for the Iranians to rationalize internally and externally their remaining in the deal. They are pushing to the Europeans and other parties to the deal to act against the JCPOA and ergo the arms embargo. They want to extend it. Now the Europeans didn't observe their commitments so far, many of their commitments, and the Iranians downgraded their commitment to the deal, but none acted very clearly against a part of the deal. Now this can be a new phase in which the United States is pushing, and to what extent the Europeans will withstand U.S. pressure not to violate and not to act against the deal and not to act against the Resolution 2231 is a major question that I think should be answered. So we are facing milestones. One is coming October, the arms embargo automatically, based on the JCPOA, will be lifted. Now, whether the European will use the snapback mechanism to push Iran to agree to a new arrangement, and how Iran will react to that is a big question. Then we have the presidential election in the United States, and then in May 2021, the presidential election in Iran, in which there are huge debates concerning Iran's foreign policy, specifically the JCPOA, and how Iran should act and how should it react to the others' violation of the deal. So I think the debates in Tehran are now focused on how to react if the arms embargo is to be extended, i.e. if the United States and Europeans agree on violating explicitly and act against the JCPOA and the Resolution 2231. There are, different set of reactions that are, spoken about in the debates, range from Iran, stopping the IAEA inspections, many of the inspections within Iran, withdrawal from the additional protocol, which Iran is observing, voluntarily have adopted, and also at the end the withdrawal from the NPT. These are debates within Iran for its reaction against such an act of against the JCPOA and the framework which remains without so much content within it. So I think these debates are very much telling how Iran is seeing the JCPOA. It's nothing really remained of the JCPOA but the inspections and a framework that can be revived, provided that there's a will on the other side. And as we heard, Joe, there's a opportunity that if a Biden administration is inaugurated, it might be able to come back to the deal with some sort of negotiations, further negotiations with Iran and other parties. But that possibility is only one possibility. There are different set of possibilities in which Iran will see, I think, within the debates that I hear here in Iran, will see how to react to each one of them. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Hassan, for your insightful comments on the perspectives and potential action plans of Iran in relations to the JCPOA. And now we can go to Ellie. Ellie, please go ahead.
Sure, thank you, and thanks to you, Younes, and the organizers for bringing us all together today. I'd like to echo my surprise, actually, that the JCPOA has survived this long. Having said that, I have been advocating for the last 4 years since Trump was elected that actually the deal can survive at least one term of the Trump administration, and we're about 6 months away from seeing if that prediction proves right or not. And I think the only reason that the deal has actually stood the test of time and essentially having the kitchen sink thrown at it by the Trump administration is because of Tehran. I think there are calculations being made in Iran that overall the strategic value of keeping the JCPOA architecture in place, despite the pressures that are facing the Rouhani government internally, despite the lack of dividends that are coming, overall, this will stand the test of time. So we'll have to see. My sense is that the next 6 months are going to present perhaps the most critical challenges to supporters of this agreement to try and keep it preserved. A couple of challenges have already been mentioned, but let me unpack them a little bit. First of all, is the issue of whether the US will carry forward its ultimatum on snapback. It doesn't look like the UN Security Council members will come to an agreement over the arms embargo that's due to expire in October. as agreed under the nuclear deal. There's been some movement from the European side to try and find some sort of a compromise that can bridge the position from the United States on the one hand and the China and Russian opposition on the other. My sense is that Secretary of State Pompeo will not really heed to compromises. It's either all in or nothing. And so we may well be looking at a position where late August, September, the US tries to push forward at the UN Security Council this notification for snapback. And I think here the reaction from China, Russia, France, and the United Kingdom will be extremely important in setting the tone in Tehran and trying to create a climate where essentially politically there is so much heavy pushback against such a move that you defang the effect of such a snapback and try and keep Iran compliant, at least to the inspection and monitoring components of the JCPOA until the outcome of the US elections are known in November. But this is going to be a tough task, and I don't frankly know whether Europeans are going to come out of this. It's clear to me that they are not supporting the US move on snapback, but how heavily they will oppose it is a question that we all need to be looking at and trying to push the Europeans to actively oppose such a move. A second issue that should be on our radar is what's happening with the International Atomic Energy Agency at the moment, and its separate discussions with Iran regarding past nuclear activities. These don't pertain to the nuclear agreement, but they could present a pathway for the United States to accelerate the dispute between the agency and Iran back to the UN Security Council. And that move could create new pressure points and new tensions between Iran and the international community on the nuclear deal in the coming months. And we've just seen a new interview with the new director of the IAEA that shows that he is going to act very tough on this issue. And on this point, I think that the Europeans have less of a role to play in trying to moderate Iran's position relative to the role that could be played constructively by China and Russia. I think China and Russia are interested in making sure that this issue on the nuclear file does not blow up at the IAEA nor at the UN Security Council. And so the council that Russia and China can provide Tehran, I think, will be quite critical on this front. The third sticking point that we should be aware of is that Iran and Europe in particular are engaged in this dispute under the JCPOA framework that's called the DRM process, the dispute resolution mechanism. Iran has in recent weeks also again filed another, what it says it's another claim to trigger the dispute resolution mechanism, and those talks are ongoing. The European countries have been pressing Iran to slow down its nuclear activities that go beyond the JCPOA, and we may come to a circumstance where by November or by January time, the certain steps that Iran has made on its nuclear activity begin to cross the red lines of the E3 governments. And that could fundamentally change the stance that the Europeans have taken so far in also exercising a degree of strategic patience with Iranian non-compliance, which could fundamentally change the dynamics we see around the JCPOA today. And finally, taking what I believe would be the best case scenario where we do have a Joe Biden victory in November, let's not forget that between November and January, there's a long period of time where the Trump administration can do a lot of damage, whether that's by introducing new sanctions with their friends in Congress to try and make it much more politically difficult for the Biden administration to re-engage Iran and re-enter the JCPOA, or frankly, by green-lighting what seem to be certain acts of sabotage against Iranian nuclear facilities that we're seeing. We are now seeing a very worrisome uptick in weekly explosions and fires across Iran. We have no idea exactly what this is being attributed to. But there has always been worry that since Secretary of State Pompeo moved from his position at the CIA into the State Department, that there would be an acceleration of covert activities inside Iran. And I think that we are likely to see an uptick, particularly if the Trump administration doesn't secure a second term, for Trump and strong allies in the region that are very much opposed to Iran, to try and throw the last punches that they can. And this could, I think, put us in a much greater risk than we have seen of any unintended military conflict emerging out of all of this. So that's my opener for you, Younes. Happy thoughts there.
Thank you very much, Ellie, for your multidimensional perspective of the Iran nuclear deal. And I mean, interesting, you all have raised points that it's worth discussing them further. And for instance, Ellie, you touched upon the dispute resolution mechanism of the deal. And we know that earlier this month, Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif sent a letter to Joseph Borrell, High Representative of the European Union, requesting to trigger the dispute resolution mechanism of the agreement. And this is a question that I have for Hassan. What are the objectives behind such a request for Iran? And what is it that Iran is aiming to achieve strategically, given that it's not the first time that Zarif is asking to trigger the mechanism of the agreement? And the follow-up question would be for Ellie. How do you think the Europeans will respond to Zarif's request? So we can start with Hassan, then we can go to Ellie.
Well, I think Mr. Zarif is echoing Iran's internal debates that the Europeans are already in violation. They are not observing their commitments, and they are. There's this, feeling and perception in Tehran that the Europeans are siding step by step, getting along with the U.S. policy against Iran. Their recent acts, according to many here in Tehran, have been more close to the U.S. policy than the past 2 years. So there's this perception that they are moving closer to the United States. Zarif is basically, my perception is that Zarif is echoing Iran's dissatisfaction, but also is warning Europeans that if they side with the United States, move closer, Iran might not, lose the appetite for even keeping the minimum of its commitments within the deal. So I think it's a warning for the arms embargo lifting. There basically possibility that the Europeans might go for that. Their recent statement and their stated policies vis-a-vis Iran and the United States and the JCPOA shows that there is this tendency within Europe, especially in Britain. And so this is basically, I think, I take it as a warning that Iran will not sit on its hands. It will, it have some, steps to take in retaliation, and that he's basically also talking to the Iranians in the Iranians' internal debates that Iran is not only, trying to push against the United States, it is also forcing and putting more pressure on the Europeans to basically not side with the U.S. and basically give Iran the space to make it possible for Tehran to stay in the deal. Otherwise, it will be hard for the Iranian officials to, and basically this administration, the Rouhani administration, to sell the argument that staying in the deal is worth it, and we need to stay in the deal.
Thank you. And Ellie, how do you think the Europeans will respond?
Sure. Look, so this so-called DRM process, it's a mechanism that's in some ways being used in all the ways that it was intended, but also in a completely different scenario to what anyone could have imagined when the deal was agreed. So nobody could have ever imagined that this DRM process would be triggered in a situation where the US has withdrawn from the agreement. And the actual mechanics of it become much more complicated because of that, the fact that one of the key partners in that discussion is missing. So from Iran's side, they have claimed they have repeatedly actually brought up the DRM process. And from the European side, they are claiming that actually it was only until the most recent move that they recognize Iran has triggered the dispute resolution mechanism. In any case, I think these are semantics. The way that the dispute resolution mechanism is working in the way it was intended is to buy time in the domestic politics of all sides to try and find some sort of a way out. Now, my sense is currently we have reached a stalemate in terms of ideas to take us beyond the current state of play in a way that the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese can convince Iran to roll back its nuclear activities. What we may have achieved in the course of those discussions, but it's not absolutely clear, is that Iran isn't going to drastically expand its nuclear activities in the coming months ahead until the US elections. And I think that that DRM process has bought time politically in the capitals of all these countries to say, look, we're having an ongoing process to resolve and contain the damage. So I think it's working in that sense of creating a cooling off period. But my own sentiment is that if we're dealing with a Trump second term after November, it's going to be very hard to sustain the current state of play over the DRM. We can't really play this game much longer without needing some sort of a fundamental shift in the way Tehran and Washington approach one another.
So from what I understand, while Iran and Europeans are trying to buy time, meanwhile we have the Trump administration that has launched a campaign to convince the UN Security Council members to extend the UN arms embargo, as most of the panelists talked about in their opening statement, that is set to expire in October. And the US government has threatened to invoke the snapback provision of the deal to reimpose all the UN Security Council sanctions on Iran if the council fails to extend the embargo. So Joe, is this technically or legally possible for the US to do that, given that it has officially withdrew from the deal in 2018?
No, it is not possible for the US to do this. Although the Trump administration continues to insist in this very unique legal interpretation that it's allowed, they claim they're still a party to the deal, even though they repeatedly said they had withdrawn from the deal. But the legalities aside, which I think are clear, they do not have legal standing to do this. They are just politically and diplomatically isolated. You cannot overstate how much the Trump administration in its totality has weakened and isolated the United States, has reduced its credibility, its legitimacy. The US doesn't even show up at international meetings anymore. So when it does, in this kind of grandstanding that Mike Pompeo did at the Security Council a few weeks ago, he comes in trying to bully the other members into going along with the United States. It falls flat. The bullying isn't working anymore. The threats aren't working, in part because their policy is incoherent. No one can have any confidence that following the US is going to lead to some kind of resolution of the crisis. And so you have to see this whole thing, I think, in three aspects. One, the relative weakness of the United States at this point. We talk about Iran's weakness, which is true. They've had setbacks over the last several years as well. But the US, the relative fall is more striking, is weaker. And of course, the incoherence of its policies. Number two is the relative role of Iran in the US consciousness now is greatly reduced. from what it was 10 years ago when this process started, when everyone was afraid that Israel was going to attack Iran. Remember, that's where the diplomacy started, to avert Bibi Netanyahu from starting a war that the US, it was feared, would be drawn into. That's when the diplomacy started in earnest. It led to this deal. The US public does not see Iran with the same state of concern, in part because this process has revealed that Iran is not racing to a bomb. Iran is not trying to get a bomb as fast as it can. And that Iran does not pose this great threat that Bibi Netanyahu, the Israelis, the hawks in the United States said. And as that realization has developed, the US has much bigger problems now. We are beset with an economic collapse that we haven't seen since the Depression, a pandemic that we haven't seen for 100 years, a political system that is fragmented and out of control, incoherent administration. We have much bigger problems at home. Even when the Biden administration comes in, and I hope that they will, the Iran problem is going to be a smaller focus of US anxiety, of US concern than it was in the previous period. And that makes it easier to solve. Final factor, the Israeli lobby is greatly weakened in the United States. There is much less concern about their political clout, their political contributions, the network of groups they control, like AIPAC and the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, not control, but who follow their line. They have all weakened in influence, weakened in clout. So that makes it easier, should a Biden administration come in, to sort of take a new path, go back to the JCPOA, go back to diplomatic engagement, and try to resolve some of these problems.
Thank you. So for now, it seems that Europeans are also not on board with the US on this issue. And this means that Iran will be able to technically import conventional weapons in a few months, which would possibly come from either China or Russia. Wenping, would China be ready to sell arms to Iran given the strong opposition from the United States in October when it expires? I think you're on mute, Wenping.
All right. If this arms embargo, this kind of trying failed eventually, of course, I think Iran now has this every right to get the weapons they wish to get from international market, because it's very legal. And so China also has no reason to refuse to sell those weapons that Iran wish to have, including the Russia. So this is a very, I think it's very normal things. So that's exactly why the United States wants to continue this arms embargo on Iran. So everybody knows that. So anyway, I would also like to add some points to those points we just discussed. For example, nowadays we are seems like the buying the time for keep this, the nuclear deal, keep it forward. So it's not just a buying the time issue. I want to to emphasize my previous point, those push and pull point. Right now we see some danger. That danger is this mistrust between European country and the Iranian side seems getting more and more. Not saying getting less and less. You see some like Saudi's oil facility has been bombed, and then people finger pointing to Iran, and then and the Iranian side, they think they haven't got those enough reward from their commitment to this nuclear deal. So the reward is not enough at all. And the European side saying, okay, the Iranian side, you cannot just, step on to, you should roll back all your nuclear activity. You should remain as same as before. So this is a trust now has been already building up. So who would like to see those mistrust building up? Of course, another force. They're already out from the deal. They want this deal immediately. Becoming that. So I think nowadays, when we counting on the time, say who is going to take over the White House, and then if you're only counting on, the time is not on your side. You have to resolve your problem first. So those problems, I think the first test is this arms embargo issue. So if this first test you fail to, which means this is a cracker, it's becoming bigger and bigger between the European side and the Iranian side. So only like Robbie China's thing to persuade Iran to roll back its all nuclear activity, that's not that convincing, yeah, for Iranian side, because the Iranian side simply ask for the same rewarding from their so many years those commitment. So all sanctions remain there, even add more and more sanctions, and then there's no rewarding just for their unilaterally commitment. So it's not fair, sounds like. Back to you.
Yeah, now I would like to focus on the non-US tensions. And recently, we know that there have been a series of unprecedented and mysterious fires and explosions in Iran. However, the most mysterious one was the explosion at Natanz uranium enrichment facilities. There's been a lot of speculation. A report in the New York Times claims that Israel, in coordination with the US administration, were behind the explosion at Natanz. And Hassan, given the precedent that Iran often retaliates against these attacks, should we expect a response from Iran this time as well, taking into the consideration of the current situations, both internationally with the arms embargo at stake and domestically with the pandemic?
I think there are no clarification on who's behind these attacks other than the reports you mentioned. Iranians also, some officials said that we know and we have the info, but we leave it for the right time to, unveil the facts. So, but I wouldn't be shocked to see that Israel and the current U.S. administration are behind those acts of aggression within Iran. They have stated, many times that they would engage in such activities within Iran. I think the Iranians also will, of course, do something to at least deter and deter further acts on the Israeli and the U.S. parts. We've heard in the reports Iranian cyber attacks on some Israeli targets. I think this tit for tat will continue and might, go up in the coming months. Knowing, having in mind that Israel have an interest in seeing things deteriorate between Iran and the United States and the Europeans before the U.S. elections, and maybe a U.S. Even more aggressive act against Iran in the future. Though I see it, a minimal possibility, but still it's there. With regards to the arms embargo, we've heard some comments, but let me clarify a bit that Iran, even before this embargo was introduced back in 2008 or 09, Iran really didn't buy that much of weapons from outside world. Its basic strategic tradition is that we need to build our own arms because during the 8-year war and during Iran's crises, no one was willing to sell Iranian arms when they needed them. So this doctrine is basically based on building what Iran needs internally. Now, the lifting of arms embargo is more of a symbolic, development, not of that much of substance. That won't be have that much of substance. I think in terms of Iran trying to buy much more arms that it already have, and because of the economic situation, the COVID-19, Iran has a lot in its plate to deal with, rather than focusing on buying arms from outside world that it doesn't have it in its recent history in recent decades. So I think these are basically the threat inflation, policies of the United States, Israel, to say that Iran will be very bigger of a threat to the international community if the arms embargo is lifted. So we have to, continue this embargo and keep it in place for forever, because without it, Iran will do this and that. Whereas if you look at the period before the arms embargo, you won't see that much of this development that is described by the US officials at play.
Yeah, and there are definitely those voices. And as Joe also talked about, there are hawkish elements around the president as well. Do you think that these actors would make an attempt to provoke Iran into a conflict in Trump's remaining time in power? And how effective they could be in doing that, Joe?
Yes, and possibly very effective. There are two risks of war. We've been talking about diplomacy here, but the risks of war, and Ellie mentioned these briefly, are quite real. Most experts have been worried about the stumbling into war scenario, that neither Iran nor the United States wanted a war. And you saw this. Donald Trump twice in the last 12 months almost went to war, but he himself pulled back, calculating it was not in his political interest to go to war. He would lose an election if he went to war that stimulated a global recession. But there was concern that the conflicts that are there, say with the US confronting Iranian-linked militias in Iraq, or the kind of tensions that exist every day in the Persian Gulf, might increase to the point where a shooting would start between US and Iranian forces or Iranian-backed forces and quickly escalate. But now you have the wag the dog scenario. As Donald Trump increasingly grapples with the fact that that he might lose in November, as all his options start to disappear, might he be inclined to go provoke a war to try to rally the Americans around the flag? He embraces the flag. Maybe in a desperate move, he could win re-election. Maybe that's his October surprise. I consider that quite real. And within the administration, you have to understand, you have people who want a war, who believe that this is a good thing. Read John Bolton's book. His major complaint was that Donald Trump would not go to war. So he wants this. So yes, and I believe there are some in the Iranian side who would like a war. So this war possibility remains real. The closer we get to November, the greater the risk of either stumbling or intentionally launching a conflict that could quickly spiral out of control.
Thank you very much for your response. With that, I would like to open it to our online audience to ask your questions. Now, we have some questions submitted via email, so I'm going to ask those questions first, and then I'll go to the questions submitted via Zoom. This is a question for Ellie. Former Vice President Joe Biden has said that the future Biden administration would return to the 2015 deal if the Iranian government did the same, as Joe mentioned it in his opening statement. What does this process even look like? Do you think P5 plus funds, especially Iran and the US, will simply be ready to go back to their initial positions and fully comply with their JCPOA obligations? I also read your latest tweet on shadow diplomacy. It would be nice to also elaborate on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that idea comes from a recent report that we released with ECFR a couple of weeks ago on precisely looking at post-November, what some of the scenarios for getting a diplomatic track restarted between Tehran and Washington looks like. In my opinion, it's politically unlikely in both sides that there can be direct bilateral talks from January 2020. And my recommendation has been that the E3 governments, in conjunction with Russia and China after November, if we have a Biden victory, need to begin a process for a holding pattern deal with Iran, an interim deal with Iran, that essentially freezes Iran's nuclear activities at where it is in November, ideally rolls it back slightly as well, and sets in place essentially a revised diplomatic process under the JCPOA Joint Commission umbrella, which they can invite the United States to re-enter that process quite soon after Biden takes the White House in January. Joe can speak more on this, but to my understanding, there are no limitations really for Biden to be able to say that they will re-enter that diplomatic process for both sides to come into full compliance. Now, this is likely to take at least a couple of months in terms of reversing Iran's nuclear activities and getting in place the sanctions reversal measures that are required to take the US back to full compliance to the JCPOA. And that process of getting both sides back to the JCPOA could very likely lead us to the Iranian presidential elections, which are expected in May and June of next year. And in my opinion, it's going to be really critical for the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese to bring this diplomatic process together and have a track underway so that regardless of who takes over the reins of the presidential office in Tehran, this process can continue to basically outlive Rouhani.
Can I have two fingers on that? I think that is exactly right, Ellie. I think that's exactly the right path. And part of it is because the Biden team does not have a clear idea, a clear plan for how they want to rejoin the JCPOA. They have a stock answer. President Biden will rejoin the JCPOA as long as Iran returns to compliance. Well, how do you do that? What's the sequencing there? So I would encourage all of us on this panel in China, in Iran, in Canada, to have a role in discussions now. It is not too soon to be starting informal track 2 discussions to start to lay out what would Iran accept? What would the Europeans accept? What role can China play so that you could help the Biden team develop a formula for this that I believe they would have to start executing this very soon after the November election, not January, but in November and December to do this because time is so short, because the Iranian politics are basically going to freeze the process very early in 2021.
Thank you very much. And this is a question for Wenping. Recently, there have been extensive discussions around a proposed Iran-China long-term strategic partnership document, which calls for an extraordinary degree of cooperation between the two countries in ways that Nick Haley, former US ambassador to the UN, said, and I quote, would end Iran's international isolation. What's your take on that? And is China ready to absorb the US penalties that it may face for its partnership with Iran? Wenping, if you could unmute and then speak, please.
Okay.
Perfect. We can hear you now.
Well, I'm not a diplomat, so I also overheard this kind of opinion. So to my observation, I don't think we need at the current time saying to upgrade. Yeah, the relation between China and Iran already quite good. Yeah, quite good. So you're saying adding some upgrade is level. So it's just symbolic, huh? If it's symbolic, but in the real sense, yeah, you can see even the Huawei, we call her is the queen of Huawei, now even has been detained in Canada. So actually, the things China can do is still those diplomatic support, like in the UN level, and also joining together with Russia and with the European partner, yeah, to save this deal. So I don't have an inside story about this thing becoming very strategic or whatever. Even though there are some kind of new thing, I think it's also like our Iran Hassan said, yeah, something is just a symbolic, it's not in substantial way.
Thank you very much. And this is the last question directed at Hassan. Recently, the conservatives took the control of Iranian parliament, the Majlis. Many expect that it is highly possible that conservatives will also win in the presidential race and replace the moderates in the executive branch. How much do you think this shift can alter Iran's foreign policy and a strategic approach towards the JCPOA and potential future negotiations with the US?
Well, I think all in all, the Iran strategic decision-making process is bipartisan to to a large extent. It is decided within the Iranian National Security Council, which includes, of course, the president and some ministers. Now we have the moderate president and his ministers in that house. If a conservative principalist administration is inaugurated, they will be in that place. So their policy will be more heard, more pursued in that sense. So I think all in taking their precedent, the principalist will be more cautious in dealing with the United States, with the EU, in any setting, not only the JCPOA. They lack the trust that maybe the moderates had in the multilateral diplomacy with the Europeans and the United States. But as I said, because the decision-making process is really bipartisan to a large extent, I wouldn't expect Iran to, get out of the JCPOA and reverse course all of a sudden. I think this is not going to happen. Iran's general policy will continue the same with different, approaches, with a more, with less trust. You would see more cautious steps on the part of Iran in dealing with the Europeans. That will affect the JCPOA and other issues in between.
Perfect. With that, first of all, if anybody has any final comments or final thoughts that wants to share, feel free to chime in. If not, then I would like to end this panel and thank you again to our panelists for accepting our invitation, attending this panel, and also to all of our participants. We will